Okay, you could begin presenting.
Hi, good morning. Me and my colleagues are here to present leadership and the qualities in leadership. Chapter 6 talks about how leadership isn't just about having authority or making decisions, it's about having the courage to do what's right, even when it's difficult. Great leaders don't just let fear stop them from taking action, whether it's standing up for their values or challenging outdated systems and admitting when they've made a mistake. The chapter also explains the leadership of authorization and participative and servant leadership and how courage plays a role in each one. Being a courageous leader means accepting responsibility, inspiring trust, and making tough decisions, even if they're unpopular. Throughout history, leaders like Expos Corporation have shown that real leadership takes boldness and integrity. The chapter also discusses the common fears that hold leadership back, like fears of failure and criticism, and ways to overcome them. Next slide, please. Great leaders don't just make easy choices. They make tough, sometimes unpopular decisions that require boldness and confidence. Next slide, please. What is leadership? What often comes to your mind when you think of courage? When we think about courage, when we think about leadership, we often picture someone strong, confident, and decisive. But what really makes a great leader? One of the most important qualities is courage. Courage in leadership means being able to make a tough decision even when there's fear, uncertainty, or opposition. It doesn't mean you're never afraid. It means you act when you are. Example: Malala Yousafzai fought for girls' education despite serious threats. Was she afraid? Yes, but she took action anyway, and that's true leadership and courage. Question: can you think of a leader who make a bold, courageous decision? Anybody want to answer?
I'll
Nobody?
say I'll say like governments and presidents who have to make bold and courageous decisions for the betterment of our country.
Exactly, and you're right. We could go on to slide 3, please. There are different types of courage in leadership. Standing up for what's right. Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower, risked her career to expose unethical practices. Taking, taking responsibilities for failure, Elon Musk once admitted Tesla's production failures publicly instead of blaming others. Challenging the startup of Coke, Steve Jobs launched the iPhone when critics thought it would fail, making unpopular decisions. A CEO might need to lay off employees to save a company. Can move on, please. Why is courage important in leadership? Imagine working under a leader who never takes risks, never stands up for their team, or never admits mistake. Would you trust them? No. So why courage matters so much in leadership? First, it builds trust and credibility. People respect leaders who stand by their values. It also inspires and motivates teams. When a leader is willing to take risks and push forward, their team feels empowered to do the same. Courage is also what drives innovation. Think about leaders like Steve Jobs. He wasn't afraid to challenge the norm, and because of that, he changed technology forever. And finally, courage helps leaders overcome the fear of failure. Every leader makes mistakes, but the ones who grow are those who aren't afraid of to try again. A great example: is Nelson Mandela. Despite facing imprisonment for 27 years, he never gave up on his vision for a free and equal South Africa. Next slide, please. Barriers of leadership. Of course, having a courage isn't always easy. Many leaders struggle with fear of failure, fear of being criticized, or even self doubt. Some leaders avoid taking risks because they are afraid of making the wrong decision. Others hesitate to challenge the status quo because they worry about what people will say. Resistance to change sometimes is just easier to stick with what's familiar. But great leaders push past these fears. I have a question. What do you think hold most leaders back from being courageous? Anybody? Okay. Apple removed the headphone jack. People was very furious. But today wireless headphones are the new norm. Next slide, please. Developing leadership courage. So, how can leaders develop courage? It starts with self awareness, knowing what you stand for and what you believe in. Then it's about practicing small acts of courage every day, whether it's speaking up in meetings, taking responsibility for mistakes, or making a difficult decision. One of the most important ways to grow as a leader is to learn from failure. Every great leader has faced setbacks, but the difference is they use those experiences to improve. And a mentor can help someone who has been through leadership decisions before can guide you. Next slide, please. Nelson Mandela. He fought against apartheid, spent 27 years in prison, and still came out determined to create change. Instead of seeking revenge, he chose reconciliation and unity, eventually becoming South Africa's first black president. He showed the world that true courage isn't about fighting, it's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Next slide, please. Play the video.
This continent knows the true meaning of racism. Its peoples have both been perpetrators of racism against others and themselves the victims of an insane and murderous racist ideology. We understood that we could not end the nightmare by surrendering ourselves to the passion of hatred and the spirit of vengeance and retribution. We are striving to proceed in a manner and towards a result which will ensure that all our people, both black and white, emerge as victors. We recognized President de Klerk and his colleagues in the National Party as men and women of integrity. We are therefore prepared to work with them to arrive at a just and lasting negotiated solution. It must result in the transformation of South Africa into a united, democratic, and non-racial country. Anything less than this would condemn our country to worsening and economic conflict. Every adult South African must have the right to participate in governing our country through a system of one person, one vote. The human rights of all our citizens must be guaranteed. The apartheid system in our country continues. We continue to be ruled by a white minority government. All the other pillars of the apartheid system have not yet been removed. The masses of our people must therefore continue the struggle within our own country. The international community shares the same obligation. We thank you most sincerely for awarding us with the Sakharov Prize. We take it as a challenge above all to have the courage to fight for justice and peace. Whatever the obstacles, we shall try not to fail you. Thank you. This
Courage in everyday life. Courage isn't just for presidents or CEOs. You use it in everyday life. Standing up to a bully, admitting when you're wrong, speaking up in tough conversation. Practicing courage now will make you a better leader in the future. Next slide, please.
So thank you, Kiana, and I'll be taking over now to discuss servant leadership. Servant leadership is a form of moral-based leadership where leaders tend to prioritize the fulfillment of the needs of followers, namely employees, customers, and other stakeholders rather than satisfying their personal needs. So it encourages change toward turning followers into leaders, thereby developing their potential rather than using a leadership position to control or limit people. We will now come to the four-stage approach to servant leadership, and I broke them into pieces before we see the bigger picture. So first would be stage one. This is control, and it would be for an authoritarian leader that leads into obedient followers. This type of relationship would entail subordinates who are passive and can't act for themselves. They must adhere to all instructions given from the leader. Stage two is participation, and it would incorporate a participative leader that leads into team players. This type of relationship would entail a leader who involves their followers through the decision-making process. Stage three is empowerment. This would be for a stewardship leader or a steward leader, and it leads into self-responsible employees. This type of relationship would entail a leader who directs responsibility and authority towards their followers. Last but not least, stage four, this is service, and this is for a servant leader that leads into whole employees. This type of relationship would entail a continuation from stewardship that gives followers full control, with the leader aiming to serve them instead. So this would be the full chart from stage 1 to 4. It's a continuous progression, so changing leader focus from self to others. And at the bottom, as you could see from the left, control is centered in the leader, and as it progresses to the right, control becomes centered in the follower. So, just as how I explained briefly before, authoritarian management encapsulates the form of an authoritarian leader who holds the power and control over everything with very little input from their followers, so employees or whatnot. In this setting, an authoritarian leader directs the strategies, goals, and even the methods and rewards for attaining them. So, as you can see from the points here, they would hold the most power over their subordinates. They are usually in full control and reside at the top of an organization's hierarchy, and subordinates are obedient and must follow instructions given. Of course, on the left here, I use a very extreme example, Adolf Hitler, but I think it could drive the point home fairly quickly. Just a little more points about authoritarian management. Organizational stability and efficiency are paramount, and followers are routinized and controlled along with machines and raw materials. Subordinates are given no voice in creating meaning and purpose for their work and no discretion as to how they perform their job. This leadership mindset emphasizes tight top-down control, employee standardization and specialization, and management by impersonal measurement and analysis. We now get to participative management. Now, participative management is a horizontal management style in which all employees are involved in the life of the company, including strategic decision making. So this type of management would have initiatives to incorporate follow-up participation and feedback, and that would take the form of, suggestion programs, participation groups, quality circles. They would have a greater role of autonomy to create and provide feedback towards a decision. It encourages team building, commitment, retention, and efficiency. It also promotes open communication based on an employee's area of expertise. I gave the example here on the left, Bill Gates, who I think is a great example, at least in the how he ran Microsoft in the early days, release of Windows 95, even extending to the gaming platform Xbox. Um, he was for sure a leader who always wanted to incorporate his his employees to give their feedback, and it was quite popular actually for him to just love putting teams against each other, and he would just be in the room listening to both sides, again from people and their expertise. So this was a study from the text, but I wanted to share it. It was done by the Association for Quality and Participation, which revealed that at the time, more than 70% of the largest US corporations have adopted some kind of employee participation program. Interesting to note is that while this form of management gives employees a voice in the decision-making process, it still is very restricted and does not redistribute power and authority to lower-level workers. The points on the slide here, top leaders will still determine purpose and goals, make final decisions, and decide rewards. Employees are expected to make suggestions for quality improvement, act as team players, and take a greater responsibility for their own jobs, but they are not allowed to be true partners in the enterprise. So, just that example, Bill Gates, no matter what idea you come up with, he could use the idea, but ultimately he reserves the right to what direction he wants to take it. We now move on to stewardship, or this would be for a steward leader. Stewardship entails a leader who empowers their followers to make decisions and have control over their jobs. It gives followers the power to influence schools, systems, and structures and become leaders themselves. It is a belief that leaders are deeply accountable to others as well as to the organization without trying to control others, define meaning and purpose for others, or take care of others. It includes all aspects of the organization's resources and well-being, which must be managed with care, foresight, and accountability. Here would just be a video, 6 ways of effective stewardship.
The definition of steward is somebody who is responsible for taking care of assets May they be human capital assets, financial assets, intellectual capital assets. How do you protect it, preserve it, but equally grow it and enhance it?
Steward leadership is the genuine desire and persistence to create a collective better future because it goes beyond just the shareholder.
Organizations are responsible not just to their shareholders, but to all stakeholders, including customers, employees, the environment, supply chain partners, and the broader community.
Commitment to diversity, commitment to sustainability, commitment to inclusiveness. How do you show me that this is not just something that is peripheral to your work, but it's part of your business DNA? The values that you espound, the strategies that you put in place, which are aligned with steward leadership.
We can see which are the ones who genuinely are embedding these in their business strategies. It's not done something on a standalone, separately, but it's really intertwined into the fabric of the decision making on a day-to-day process.
What I find really powerful are people who can both be doers and at the same time stay able to reflect upon themselves. Because it means we're not plunging headlong into doing the next thing just because we know we need to do it, but we're thoughtful, we're reflective.
All of that comes through in integrity. Are they changing the industry or the ecosystem that they're in a positive way? That needs to be found in a good stewardship leader.
It's doing the right thing as defined by your values. You know, integrity, doing the right thing when no one's looking. Well, stewardship is a refinement of that. It's doing the right thing while everyone's looking for the right reason.
And even if your goal is to become financially wealthy, you gotta do the right thing, because otherwise this market, this empowered market, will shun your product or your service.
Okay, so now we move on to 4 principles of stewardship, and I'll go through each principle one at a time. So the first principle is reorient toward a partnership assumption. This essentially means a shift of power from former leaders to core workers. Partners have the right to say no, honesty and transparency are key, and there's a joint responsibility for defining vision, purpose, and accountability for all outcomes. The second principle is localize decisions and power to those closest to the work and the customer. This means that the decision-making power and authority must be placed at the endpoint of where the work gets done. It requires the reintegration of both management and work so that everyone is doing some of the core organizational work part of the time. No one is being paid to plan and manage the work of others. The third principle is recognize and reward the value of labor. This means that the reward system ties everyone's fortunes to the success of the enterprise. There's a redistribution of wealth through compensation, core workers gain significant gains, everyone earns by delivering real value, and the organization pays everyone as much as possible. The final principle is expect core work teams to build the organization. This means that core organizational teams define goals, maintain controls, create a nurturing environment, and reorganize to respond to the ever-changing marketplace. We move on to the final and the fourth stage approach, the servant leader. So this further builds upon stewardship and is a complete 180 of the traditional organizational structure. Servant leaders transcend self-interest to serve the needs of others, help others grow and develop, and provide opportunity for others to gain materially and emotionally. Servant leaders prioritize service towards their employees, customers, shareholders, and the general public. Its focus is strictly on how to serve others over personal gain, which incorporates a mindset shift. Servant leaders understand their role towards the betterment of their employees, which in turn leads to positive benefits such as empowerment, participation, shared authority, and building a community of trust. So I have a quick question for the class. Does anyone know, I called the first, it was Hitler, the second was Bill Gates. Does anyone know who is the man in this picture here? It's fine. I'll assume maybe not as recognizable. But this is Herb Kelleher. He was the CEO and co-founder of Southwest Airlines. Unfortunately, he did pass in 2019, but I used him as an example because he's he's the embodiment of a servant leader. And a lot of the traits and the way of life that he would have operated for his company when he was in power, it embodies it. Yeah, I'm not playing the whole video. Yeah, I have something on what is servant leadership.
Hi, this film talks about servant leadership, what it is and why it makes sense. Servant leadership is a tried and tested leadership approach that's about creating a shift from managing for results to designing environments that create results. Robert Greenleaf coined the phrase servant leadership in the 1970s. It's a form of leadership that replaces self-interest with service to others. Servant leadership is about influence rather than power and control, focusing on others' strengths rather than weaknesses, listening rather than giving orders, and long-range benefits rather than short-term profits. Servant leaders demonstrate a range of 9 key attributes. The good news is that all of these can be developed. Listening, self-awareness, foresight, empathy, persuasion, stewardship, healing, conceptualization, and building a sense of community. Hi.
So from the video, for those who have been listening keenly there, you would have heard the name Robert K. Greenleaf. But who is Robert K. Greenleaf? And I also titled him The Man with a Greater Vision. So Robert K. Greenleaf was a highly influential figure behind the concept of servant leadership. He first pursued a career as the Director of Management Research for AT&T in 1964 and would later become the founder of the Center for Applied Ethics. He would become inspired through a novel titled Journey to the East and would later publish The Servant as Leader in 1970. Greenleaf explored and described the concept of what it means to become a servant leader and how the relationship between the leader, followers, and society as a whole are impacted. Here I would have just a tidbit of this video that could go a little more in depth, lightly, and visually about what I just said.
Robert Greenleaf has to think about anything is to start to write. Things fall into place better for him when he has a pencil in his hand. He was helped at this point by reading the writings of the contemporary German novelist Hermann Hesse, who at that time was widely read by students. In Hesse's writing, he came across a little book, Journey to the East, that intrigued him. This is an account of a mythical journey by a band of men on a search to the East, probably Hesse's own search. The central figure of the story is Leo, who accompanies the party as the servant who does their menial chores, but who also sustains them with his spirit and his song. He is a person of extraordinary presence. All goes well with the journey until one day, Leo disappears. Then the group falls into disarray and the journey is abandoned. They could not make it without the servant Leo. The narrator, one of the party, after some years of searching, finds Leo and is taken into the order that had sponsored the search. There, he discovers that Leo, whom he had first known as a servant, was in fact the titular head of the order, its guiding spirit, a great and noble leader.
One can muse on what Hesse was trying to tell us when he wrote this story. There's been much speculation on Hesse's life and work, some of it centering on this story that critics find most confusing. But to me, this story clearly says the great leader, who may also be a little person, is seen as servant first. Leadership is bestowed on a person who is by nature a true servant. Leadership is something given or assumed that can be taken away. Leo's servant nature was the real person, not bestowed, not assumed, and not to be taken away. Leo was servant first.
Robert Greenleaf had.
And now we get to my last slide here. And just as with the four principles of stewardship, I would go through each of them one by one. So this is Greenleaf's servant leadership model and includes four. The first is put service before self-interest. This would entail prioritizing the helping of others over achieving formal leadership or power. It advocates for doing what is good and right for others, even if it doesn't financially increase revenue. It views the organization as much about providing meaningful work to the employee as it is about performing work for the organization. The second is listen first to affirm others. This would entail a servant leader who asks questions, not having any correct answers per se. They will listen, affirm confidence, and understand the problems of others. From listening to other groups, they will strive to support it. They also don't impose their will, but will contribute to the best course of action. The third is to inspire trust by being trustworthy. This would entail building trust through honesty, giving up control, and prioritizing others' well-being. Sharing of all information is encouraged, both positive and negative, which helps to make better decisions for the group's benefit. And lastly, nourish others and help them become whole. This would entail a servant leader who cares deeply about their followers' spirits as well as their minds and bodies, and they believe in the unique potential of each person to have a positive impact on the world. It requires an openness and willingness to share both pain and difficulty of others. This goes both ways, resulting in a servant leader who also becomes vulnerable, showing their own pain and humanity. So with that, I now pass you along to my next colleague, Aline.
Good morning. So I'll be doing leadership courage. Many people would assume that leadership is about authority or decision making, but that's not the case. It's about doing the right thing in the most difficult times. Next slide, please. Right. So what is leadership courage? Leadership courage is the ability to act despite fear, opposition, or uncertainty. It's not about being fearless, it's about pushing forward despite fear. Many leaders would hesitate to take action because they are afraid of failure, rejection, or conflict. I included some keywords here: backbone, fortitude, and moral strength. Um, all of these are what a strong leader should have in order to make these decisions. True leadership courage means making the hard choices, standing firm on values, and taking risks for the greater good. This applies in all areas, whether it be business, politics, social justice, even our personal lives. Think about Elon Musk with SpaceX. He risked his entire fortune to fund SpaceX, despite the overwhelming doubts about it, and now it's a successful company. Next slide. Courage is the foundation of great leadership. Without it, progress would stall, innovation dies, and unethical practices go unchallenged. Leaders who lack courage prioritize popularity over principles, which leads to weak decision making. Take General Eric Shinseki. He told Congress that the Iraq War would require more troops than originally planned. He knew that it would cost him his career. But he chose honesty over pleasing his superiors, and history proved him right. Leaders who show courage build trust. Imagine working for a boss who avoids difficult decisions or blame others for failures. You wouldn't respect them. When a leader owns their choices, even when things go wrong, people would respect and follow them. One question, why do leaders sometimes fear speaking up? Um, does anybody want to answer this? No? Okay, well, next slide. So, challenging the status quo. One of the most challenging aspects of leadership is going against the norm. Many people would prefer to play it safe rather than speak out against wrongdoing. Look at Clive Rowell at Volkswagen. Uh, Remember that name because it will be important in a few slides. He transformed leadership culture, and also challenging status quo is risky. Look at whistleblowers like Colleen Rowley. Expose corruption knowing they would lose their jobs. Courageous leaders don't just accept what's easy, they push for what's right. I have another question for the class. Would you challenge a superior if something felt wrong? Yes, no. Okay, well, okay, go ahead, Olivia.
Oh, yes, I would, especially if I had proof to support my suspicions, I would challenge, yes.
Right, that's really good. Okay, next slide. Accepting responsibility. So many leaders will avoid taking responsibility for their mistakes because they fail, because they think they would look weak. They care more about their egos. The truth is, owning up to mistakes builds credibility, respect, and trust. One powerful example is Barbara Johns. She was a 16-year-old at the time who led a student strike against school segregation. She saw injustice and took action, even when adults hesitated. This shows that leadership courage isn't about age or authority, it's about conviction. I also have another example. Um, in the Bible, Paul is encouraging Timothy to become a leader as a young man. And he he told him, let no one despise your youth, but set an example for the believers in speech and conduct, in love and faith and purity. This shows that a proper leader doesn't matter what age you are, it doesn't matter what gender, it doesn't matter who you are. You can become a great leader in general. So, in contrast, weak leaders would shift the blame. We've seen this in politics, business scandals, and even in the workplace. Taking responsibility isn't just about admitting failure, it's about learning from mistakes and setting a positive example. Next slide. Overcoming fear and taking risks. So, fear is one of the biggest barriers in leadership. People fear failure, they fear rejection, and they would fear judgment. But a courageous leader would recognize that every great achievement comes with risk. Even historical figures struggle with this. Look at Charles Darwin. He delayed publishing the Origin of Species for 20 years because he feared backlash. But without risk, there's no progress. Think about a time you let fear hold you back from something. What happened? You didn't get anywhere because fear holding back anything wouldn't get you anywhere in life. Taking the risk is the most important part. Next slide. How to develop leadership courage. Courage isn't just something you are born with, it's a skill you can build over time. Start with your self-reflection. What do you truly stand for? And then seek mentorship. You learn from people who demonstrate courage before you. And then take small steps outside your comfort zone, and soon bigger challenges won't seem as daunting. I can give an example of myself. I was timid and shy, and now I go up and I just using an example at church. I go up, I bravely read scripture verses, I do stuff, I talk to people. I couldn't do these things before, and I make decisions that are effective. Next slide. So, as I mentioned before, Clive Rorlow, he changed the leadership culture in Volkswagen by shifting from fear-based control to trust and autonomy. Volkswagen now owns over 10 of the world's biggest automotive brands, and he encouraged managers to make their own decisions, which was great. Next slide. So, ethical dilemma. So now let's apply what we learned. So I have a question for the class here. Imagine your boss asks you to cover up an unethical mistake. What would you do? Anybody? Okay, well, if you refuse, you might lose your job, right? And if you agree, you would compromise your values. And if people find out, they will lose their trust in you. Next slide. So I have this video here. I just would like to play for the class.
Yeah, there was a really famous cartoon back in the 80s, The Beatings Will Continue Until the Morale Improves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always thought that was hilarious because it's so terrifyingly accurate.
And astonishingly, look, I'm embarrassed that I have a career. You know, I talk about things like trust and cooperation. Why is there demand for my work? You know? But the fact that there is, I'll take it as an opportunity.
Yeah.
But what's really sort of abominable is that this is not a new idea. Like, there are books galore and speeches galore and articles galore about what leadership is. You know, and we all kind of say the same thing from a different angle, so you can pick your flavor, whichever message resonates most with you, and yet people don't do it. What's the hang up? And so I get this question a lot, which is, what are the most important characteristics about being a leader? You know, vision, charisma, you know? I know some spectacular leaders who don't have big Steve Jobsian visions. They're just not visionary, you know? And I know some spectacular leaders who really don't have a lot of charisma. They kind of just shuffle around and you're like, that's the guy, that's the guy, right? And they're spectacular and people will give blood, sweat, and tears for these people. The one thing I am comfortable saying that all effective leaders must have is courage, because it is hard. It is hard to stand up against outside pressure. It is hard to stand up to an external constituency who's pushing you to do something for their short-term gain, to do the right thing for your people. It is hard. It is thankless. It is lonely. It's sometimes you get fired. Sometimes you get in trouble. Sometimes you'll lose your job and the next guy will get all the credit. It's all true. And the courage to do the right thing in the face of overwhelming pressure, only the best leaders have that courage. Only the best leaders. And here's the folly. Courage is not some deep internal fortitude. You don't dig down deep and find the courage, right? It just doesn't exist. Courage is external. Our courage comes from the support we feel from others. In other words, when you feel that someone has your back, when you know that the day that you admit you can't do it, someone will be there and say, I got you. You can do this. That's what gives you the courage to do the difficult thing. It's not going off to an ashram by yourself somewhere for 4 weeks and coming back and finding the courage. It's not what happens. It's the relationships that we foster. It's the people around us who love us and care about us and believe in us. And when we have those relationships, we will find the courage to do the right thing. And when you act with courage, that in turn will inspire those in your organization to also act with courage. In other words, it's still an external thing. That's what inspiration is, right? I'm inspired to follow your example. But those relationships that we foster over the course of a lifetime will not only make us into the leaders we need to be and hope we can be, but they'll often save your life. They'll save you from depression. They'll save you from giving up. They'll save you from any matter of negative feelings about your own capabilities, your own future. When someone just says, "I love you, and I will follow you no matter what."
Why do you, so I want to talk about that for a second. Why do you think that something so innate, so deeply ingrained in us as love is so, like just yesterday, I can't believe this is true, this is actually true, I'm not making this up. Just yesterday, this will mean something to you guys, I looked Ron Penna in his eyes and I said, "I love you." And I said it like 100%, is my business partner, I said it 100% sincerely. It was just one of those moments where you want to connect and remember. But that's so weird. Like, I don't do that often. And it's so interesting that it becomes out of context,
Sure.
maybe is the best way to say it. Because, like, at home with my wife, it's so easy, and I love to embody it, and I love to feel it, and it makes me feel awesome. But then I come into the office, and there's something about the context that makes it weird.
Yes, two perspectives. One is this is what vulnerability is, right? Being vulnerable doesn't mean crying. Being vulnerable means willing to admit you made a mistake. Being vulnerable is the willingness to say, "I need help." Being vulnerable is the willingness to express the feelings you have towards someone without fear of what other people may think of you by making that expression. And most people, especially if they don't have a trusting environment or a strong corporate culture, most people don't want to feel vulnerable. It's dangerous to feel vulnerable. If you admit you made a mistake or you don't know what you're doing, you've been promoted into a job that you have no clue or no business being in that job, lying, hiding, and faking is a much better option, right? But for the fact that it's more stressful and ultimately the results will falter, right? It's counterintuitive. But that's what a strong environment means. It means I can be vulnerable. So the fact that you can say that out loud means that there's a loving, trusting culture here that is okay with you being vulnerable. Nobody's thinking, "Oh my God, this company's going downhill. This guy's nuts. He's blubbering all over the place." That's not what people are thinking. I mean, some people are probably thinking it, but generally that's not what people are thinking. If anything, people are going, "Cool," and that then inspires them to feel that they can also express vulnerability, like admit a mistake, like say they screwed up, like say they need help, that say, they want to offer help to someone and not fear that either. So that's one perspective. The other reason why stuff that I talk about or that you're talking about now is so often ignored is just because it's hard to measure. How do you measure leadership? How do you measure?
That's going to be one of my questions.
How do you measure trust? They lack good metrics. It's very easy to measure revenues and profits and market share. So let's focus on those things because I can like pull a lever here and see what happens over there.
Right.
But in terms of like trust, I'll pull a lever here and I won't see anything for 6 months. So it's not that I don't know that it exists. Everybody talks about the importance of culture, yet nobody seems to be focused on building it. I've never met a CEO in my life who doesn't think people are important. And yet every day they're making decisions that prioritize a number over a person that literally don't care about people. They make decisions that literally brush people aside because it's hard to measure. In an ultra speedy, algorithmic world that we live in, what gets measured gets done. These things are measurable, just not in the short term.
Yeah, there was a really...
So, some key takeaways from this video here. Courageous leaders act despite fear. They don't wait for the perfect moment. Trust is key. Leaders must create an environment where people feel safe to take risks. And vulnerability is strength. Leaders who admit mistakes and seek feedback gain more respect. Real leadership is about sacrifice, putting others before personal gain. And again, with the challenge in the status quo, do what is right, not what is easy. So, I have a final question for the class. How can you apply courage in leadership today? Anyone? Doesn't have to be a long answer. It can be a short answer. It doesn't matter.
I
Hi.
I think you could apply it with diversity. If you're a leader, I of whatever group you have the courage to have an open mind and bring in whether you have different people from different backgrounds, social backgrounds, sexual orientation. Um, I think courage could fit in
Mm-hmm.
somehow in that.
Right, that's a good example there. That's good. Thank you. So, lastly, I just want everybody to take this away. So he fed them according to the integrity of his heart and guided them by skillfulness of his hands. That's Psalm 70:72. That is also what a leader would do. So that's it for my presentation there. Thank you. And off to the conclusion. So today we would have learned about servant leadership, that leadership courage is the defining trait that separates good leaders from great ones, and from standing up for what is right and taking responsibility for failures. We also explore different leadership frameworks, also including servant leaderships, stewardship, authoritarian, and participative management styles. The shift from self-centered leadership to service-driven leadership fosters trust, accountability, and long-term success. The four-stage approach to servant leadership, Daft 2008, which is the book we used, and Robert K. Greenleaf Servant Leadership, which was in Christian's slide, um, model further emphasize how true leadership is about empowering others rather than seeking control. Thank you. These are our references.